I'll be talking today just a little bit following up from this morning session and how some of the targets that were talked about this morning and how technologies might apply in the developing country context. And in that, since the specific technology issues we covered this morning, I'll just skip over some of those slides here that I had on technologies because I think Dr. Haywood did a good job in summarizing it for the developed world. This work? Yes. I think the first issue is that the developing country markets are indeed quite different than the developed country markets. And what we see here is that North America and the EU markets have fairly high cost technology for improving fuel economy. And the other issue is that many developing countries have fuel economy that's already better than, in some cases, the 2020 target for for the US, for example. I think India is now somewhere around 155 grams per kilometer for CO2. Mexico is also in the same region, and Mr. Fangan tells me that China may be in the low 160s. And I think the target for 2020 in the US is about 165 grams or so, and in the EU it's 140 or 130. So in a sense, the baseline we're starting from in many developing countries is very, very high. And of course, it's not any great secret why. Most of the cars are quite small. And this gives you some idea of just a simple comparison of where things are in fuel economy space. As you can see in North America, large engines, big cars, very low diesel penetration, mostly automatic transmissions, and average price of about $27,000. Europe is much more fuel efficient, partly due to the smaller engine size, and partly due to the higher diesel penetration. And also very high level of things like manual transmission use. Automatics are not so popular here, fewer cars with air conditioning. But in contrast to, I think, what was said in this morning, if you take the same vehicle in the US and Europe, in fact, the US vehicle is actually a little more efficient because they don't have to gear it for the very high speeds on the highway. And in fact, the tires are a little better in rolling resistance, just for that one reason. In India, in contrast, I think the typical vehicle is a size that's not even sold in the US. I don't think you can buy a vehicle with less than 1.5 liter engine displacement. And the price is very low. Average price is $8,000, and I think certainly everyone's talked about the Tata Nano coming out at about $3,000, and you can also see now, but diesel penetration is going up, and I understand automatic transmission is also going up, but the diesel penetration going up is because diesel is subsidized in India. So basically what we see is that consumers value different things in different nations, and it's clearly dependent on income. US, big country, big people, and so big car, and high incomes to support that. And the European market, I think, again, everyone is saying it's the price of fuel, but I don't think that's true. All our studies show that about 5 years ago, the price in Europe was very similar to what it is today in the US. But what we're seeing is that the US still has much larger vehicles than Europe. Part of it, of course, is Europe has very good public transport, very limited parking space, tight streets, so all of those contribute to a much smaller vehicle. When we come to improving fuel economy, this was talked about extensively this morning. The general methods are very well known. And what I want to briefly touch on is the technology that people are talking about to improve fuel economy in the developed countries, mostly EU and US, and whether that's applicable to a developed country context. And I'm using India as an example because I'm more familiar with that specific market, but I think it really goes across many of these issues. For example, if you look at some of the technologies that are coming on stream today in Europe and also starting to come on stream in the US, the big difference is this turbo GDI VVT combination, which is turbocharging, reducing the size of the engine using gasoline direct injection and variable valve timing. as a single technology that has the largest effect, perhaps a 14-15% reduction in fuel consumption. And you can see what the issue is. This slide shows you what's being done in the EU, and basically the green line there represents a naturally aspirated engine, and the yellow line represented the first generation turbocharger, not direct injected. And the big problem there was that once you got the engine below 2000 RPM, which is typical in city speed, the turbo provided almost no assistance, and you couldn't downsize the engine. With the new generation, you can do that, but you can still see that the low end or the low RPM torque issue hasn't gone away completely. You've mitigated it, but it hasn't gone away. And of course, in developing countries, you run at such low speeds that you're always sort of stuck in this 1,000 to 1,500 RPM band in your engine, where literally the turbo gives you much less benefit. So that's a clear kind of illustration of what the issues are. There are other complementary issues to this. For example, when you're able to downsize the engine, the cost reduction in the base engine allows you to pay for the turbo and the GDI. But when you're starting from a very small engine, you really can't downsize that much further, partly because of that low-speed torque limitation. And in addition, if you're starting from a 4-cylinder engine and you want to go to a 3-cylinder engine, other issues come up like the noise and the vibration and so on. And in fact, in the Indian market, it already had a very popular 3-cylinder engine, but people got tired of it because, it was in the Maruti 800, but that sales of that has been dropping as the 4-cylinder engines have got on. So there are some very real issues that prevent developed country technologies being applied to developing country solutions. If you look in the midterm, what we do see is things like HCCI being contemplated, which is a new form of combustion somewhere between diesel and gasoline, and the camless valve actuation, which basically opens and closes the valves using an electromagnetic system. But the problem is that these get to be somewhat expensive solutions. So if you look at here, some of the technology solutions for the 2025 timeframe, you're looking at adding a cost of $1,000 to $1,500. So almost every % improvement in fuel economy is about $100 or more, which gets to be quite expensive in the developing country context, where the basic vehicle itself is only $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. And this is how it's done. In fact, there's a French company that is promising to have it on the street soon. But again, it's a fairly expensive solution for a developing country, and one that it's not clear that people will pay for. The other problem, of course, is that the benefits realized by some of these technologies are also largely due to what's known as pumping loss reduction. And pumping loss arises by having a large engine operate at light throttles, which is typically the case in both the EU and in the US. So you have a 2-liter or a 3-liter engine that's typically operated with 10 or 11 horsepower on the city street. You usually close the throttle quite tightly, and that increases pumping loss. But you're starting from a fairly low power-to-weight ratio in developing countries, and so pumping loss is lower in these countries. And so basically you're looking at a double discount, which is the fact that in a more price-sensitive market, and you have lower fuel economy benefit from these technologies. So it's a very risky proposition for manufacturers. I think people have talked about transmission technologies. This morning we saw Volkswagen show the double clutch transmission and so on. And all these are very efficient solutions relative to today's automatic. But if you start from, again, a mostly manual transmission base, then again the benefits become quite small. Because the basic manual transmission is good. Now, there is, of course, this issue where people are moving to, just from income effects, people are moving to automatic transmissions. And when you see that, this may prevent backsliding, but it's not going forward in any sense. People also talked about weight reduction, et cetera, drag, rolling resistance, and so on. But weight reduction, we find, is a very expensive proposition, even in the developed country context. So, in fact, we do forecasts of all these variables, and we see weight reduction as being substantially more expensive than some of these other options we've seen. The price of aluminum, for example, has doubled just in the last year. So relative to steel, steel's also gone up 30-40%, but relative to steel, it's just getting worse. So I think it's actually quite a difficult proposition to think of large weight reductions. And of course, people want more safety from their cars. So all these additions like airbags and increased structural integrity make the problem even more difficult. Now, you can do other things that get you small amounts, 2-3% rolling resistance, drag, and so on. Drag, again, low speed, you don't get very much. And the last thing, of course, is you can drive the accessories electrically with power steering, water pump, so on. One of the technologies that does, on the other side, reserve some recognition is idle stop-start. Now, basically, there has been some development of new systems that are quite cheap. I'll show you a little solution. Essentially, all it is an enhanced starter motor and a way to somehow detect when the engine is being stopped. So that you pre-engage the starter. So at the moment you step into it, the starter can turn on, you don't have the engagement noise, and you can take off immediately. Very nice system. The problem, of course, is that if you do repeated stop-starts, it stresses the battery quite a bit. And so the whole electrical system has to be beefed up to take advantage of this type of system. But in developing country traffic situations where stop-start is the primary mode of traffic, you barely go 20 feet without stopping, this could be a good solution for it. So I think this morning we heard maybe 30% in the short term and 50% in the 2030 timeframe. We fully concur with those types of assessments, but that's in the developed country context. Simple calculations for developing countries show that only about half this potential is possible in the same time frames. And for all the same reasons that I gave you, you're starting from a much different base, fewer things are cost effective, and so on. And that is, of course, all on a test fuel economy basis. Maybe in the real world, this idle stop can have a bigger effect just because of the very poor traffic conditions. Hopefully, those will improve as well. Now, all of these improvements are also, again, assuming that consumer preferences do not change. But when you start at the bottom with very small cars, consumer preferences have only one direction to go, which is up. And so we have, in the developed country context, some possibility for downsizing. In the developing country context, I think we have a possibility, not a possibility, actually happening, of upsizing. So people have talked about hybrids. There are a lot of different kinds of hybrids. I won't go into some of the details, but yes, something like the Toyota system is very efficient, but quite expensive. And I think for a developing country, we need much cheaper solutions than the Toyota type system or even the Honda system. And so hopefully we are seeing the emergence of new types of systems integrated with the transmission that may or could offer some possibilities for cost reduction. Plug-in hybrids, I think the electric bike issue was already brought up by Mike Walsh. I just did a quick calculation against it. I think the issue is that the gasoline-powered little moped that would be a substitute for the electric vehicle gets about 25 to 30 grams per kilometer CO2. And I think depending on the generation of power, you might find that in China that the electric bike may be either right at that level or perhaps even higher, because you're getting electricity from coal and you're losing quite a lot in the charging, recharging, battery loss process. But I haven't done that computation. So it'll be interesting to look at it to see whether, in fact, against a very efficient 4-stroke small moped, the electric bike does still provide an advantage. And electric vehicles are starting to become much more popular now. 200 kilometers range, I think, is possible. Cost is still very high. But I think you can do some very cheap city-type EVs. And since much of driving is quite urban in developing countries, a city-type EV doesn't have to have all of the features of a major car, can be a cost-effective solution. But I think, as has been pointed out, there are power cuts in many parts of India, for example, where you don't get power 12 hours of the day, And so it's hard to rely on your transport if the electricity shuts down or whatever. You don't have electricity for lights, leave alone for four-wheelers. So it's a very local solution. It may be optimal in some countries which have a lot of electricity, but again, coal to electricity is a big issue, and the availability of electricity is a big issue. Diesel issues, I think there was a lot said this morning, and I concur with some of these big issues. First, I think that the fuel efficiency difference between diesel and gasoline will narrow quite a bit. And so once you sort of take that effect out, greenhouse gas benefit may actually disappear because of the higher carbon content of fuel. Second, I think we heard this morning about trucking using more fuel, shipping converting to diesel, and aviation also using much more fuel. So the pressure on middle distillates is very high. In the US, prices of diesel are now 20% higher than gasoline price. And what we are seeing in developing countries is actually a subsidy for diesel fuels. And so which is basically intended for commercial transport, but if people start buying this, I think we have, I think, big problems. And Lee Shipper talked about the diesels having very high VMT. So if you have low marginal cost of driving, perhaps it will encourage driving as well. So with all these, I am very reluctant to endorse diesel as a solution for developing countries. So let me just quickly summarize. Vehicles that we're starting from, the baseline in a developing country is very, very high already. And so if people are recommending standards, I think the first issue is the issue of equity. Why should developing countries meet a much higher per vehicle CO2 standard if most vehicles are used by one or two people regardless of the size of the vehicle? So the equity issue is a big issue. Second, I think we can't convert the percentage increases that we see in developed countries directly to developing countries. My quick estimate is that maybe only about half the improvement in fuel consumption is possible relative to what was said this morning. Third, I think that we do see some benefits with unique technologies. Maybe stop-start is a good idea for developing countries where traffic conditions are poor. I think the diesel is not such a good solution, especially for the longer term, and also if the fuel is being subsidized for commercial use. And when you get to plug-in hybrid or EV, the whole issue of electric generation, availability, all of these things becomes a much bigger issue. Not saying that it's bad, but I think it needs a more comprehensive solution. And lastly, I think the main point of my talk is, yes, technologies are global. All the same 15 car companies sell cars all over the world, but technological solutions are not global. I think the technological solutions are greatly influenced by local conditions, and that in fact what we may see emerge in developing countries is much smaller than what we may see available for developed countries. Thank you.